The Titanic. It's hard to find a person who knows absolutely nothing about the tragic fate of the largest and most luxurious ship of the early 20th century. Numerous books have been written about the liner sinking in icy waters. 17 feature films and 2 TV series have been made. There's even a musical as Titanic series and a Requiem opera. However, the most famous pop culture work about this catastrophe is James Cameron's Oscar-winning blockbuster, a film that cost $200 million to make. In addition to winning 11 Oscars, Cameron's film Titanic can boast another achievement. Meticulous film historians have identified no less than 157 errors in this blockbuster. The most famous blunder is the electronic watches on the wrist of one of the drowning victims, which simply couldn't have existed in 1912. The film also includes special leashes for dogs, invented only in 1970. Another mistake involves the Statue of Liberty. In the film, it is the same color as it is now, green. However, in 1912 it was still brown, only turning green 35 years after its creation, in 1921. In large part due to this film, many people worldwide believe that the sinking of the Titanic was the largest maritime disaster in human history. However, this is nothing more than a misconception. During the sinking of the Titanic, the sea claimed 1,513 lives. However, in 1940, German bombers sank the British transport ship Lancastria off the coast of France, carrying about 7,000 people on board. The giant whirlpool created by the sinking vessel sucked in more than 4,500 people, 3 times more than the Titanic disaster claimed in 1912. An even greater number of casualties occurred when the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff was torpedoed in 1945 by a Soviet submarine under the command of Maritime. According to the official version, 7,700 people perished in that incident. Another Soviet submarine sank the German transport Goya, carrying between 5,000 and 7,000 people. British aviation also sent the liner Cap Arcona to the bottom along with 5,000 prisoners. It's worth noting that even during peacetime, there were maritime disasters with a higher death toll than the sinking of the Titanic. In 1987, approximately 4,000 people lost their lives when the ferry Doña Paz collided with a tanker off the coast of the Philippines. Returning to the mystery of the Titanic's sinking, there are several exotic theories about the causes. According to one, it was all due to a torpedo hole from a German submarine. According to another, a fire in the hold doomed the ship. According to a third, the blame lay with the mummy of Amenhotep IV, the famous Egyptian prophetess of the time of Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who was being transported on the liner. However, the widely accepted version is that the Titanic sank due to a collision with an iceberg, resulting in a massive 90-meter-long breach in the ship's hull. However, relatively recent studies of the Titanic's remains have proven even this misconception wrong. An iceberg was likely present, but as for the hole in the hull, initially, scientists found no traces of a massive breach. Yet not everything was clear, as the ship's bow was stuck in mud and the lower part of the ship was not accessible to researchers. Later, buried under a 20-meter layer of mud, the lower part of the liner was examined using ultrasound. And what was discovered? Once again, there were no signs of a grand breach, instead a chain of 6 small holes with a total area of about a square meter was found. It was these holes that doomed the unsinkable ship, as the Titanic was called before its maiden and final voyage. But so far there is still a lot of strangeness in this whole story. So much has been written about this ship that it seems there is probably no magazine or newspaper that doesn't return to this topic again and again. The legendary Titanic still captures attention. People talk about it, argue, contemplate, and put forward new versions of its demise. One thing is certain: the iceberg is the culprit of the disaster. The general course of events has been more or less explained to the average person, but there are still many questions. For example, there are numerous questions for those who found themselves not far from the sinking site. If the ships that were not too far away had arrived at the Titanic as quickly as possible, surely many more passengers would have been saved. But it happened differently. The captain of the ship California was convicted for failing to or refusing to assist the sinking ship. Truth be told, nearly 50 years later, this accusation was lifted. But just imagine what it's like to live with such an accusation. How was he vindicated? They simply managed to prove that the captain of the California could not, even with the greatest desire, have seen what was happening with the Titanic, for the simple reason that they were quite far apart from each other. By precisely proving the existence of this considerable distance, the captain was acquitted. But then a new strange mystery emerged. It turns out that both of these ships saw another vessel. Yes, according to the ship's documents, it was found that on the California, looking at this vessel, they thought it was the Titanic, while on the Titanic, they thought they saw the California in the distance. That's the confusion. That's why it was too late for the California to realize that the Titanic was sinking. By the way, the presence of a third ship between these vessels is documentary confirmed. However, they can't prove this fact. What a paradox. The ship logs of both vessels contain entries about the observation of an unknown vessel. But what ship it was and what it was doing at the time of the disaster is still unclear. The behavior of the ship is also unclear. Based on these logs, they traced the route of this mysterious ship, and it was quite strange. The ship was almost heading towards the disaster at full speed. Then suddenly it drifted and, in fact, didn't hurry to rescue people. And then it sailed in a completely different direction. After proving the existence of the third ship 50 years later, they acquitted the captain of the California. But the question of what that mysterious ship was remained unanswered. The answer to this question has not been found to this day. The sinking of the largest ocean liner named the Titanic is the most famous and discussed tragedy of its kind. Countless documents have been researched on this topic. Memories of thousands of witnesses are recounted. Hundreds of papers and books have been written, and documentary and fictional films have been made. Nevertheless, the mystery of the sinking of the unsinkable ship is still not fully solved, and moreover, the echo of this greatest tragedy resonates to our times. The location of the sinking of this unsinkable liner, which went down in the cold waters of the Atlantic after colliding with an iceberg on April 15, 1912, is at coordinates 414355, north latitude, 49°56'45", west longitude, about 600 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland. During this catastrophe, 1,513 people out of 2,224 passengers and crew drowned. Only 701 unfortunate souls were saved by the ship Carpathia. Currently, the Titanic lies a few miles from the coordinates transmitted by the radio operator at the time of the sinking and was discovered only recently. The search was hindered by the immense depth at which the considerably rusted and algae-covered wreckage of the ship lies, 3,750 meters. Technologies for searches at such depths simply did not exist before. Let's immediately mention that the mystical background of this event, connected with the name of the ship, began 2,000 years ago with an ancient myth that Zeus cast down the rebellious giants, the Titans, into the dark depths of Tartarus. The tragedy of the Titanic became legendary and is associated with various unexplainable incidents, coincidences, and prophecies. Unfortunately, attention was only drawn to them after the ship's demise. For example, even during the ship's construction at the Belfast shipyard, there were persistent rumors among the dock workers about the Titanic's impending ill fate. They repeatedly heard strange knocks in the part of the ship where its double bottom was located. They attributed these knocks to the presence of an entire shipyard worker brigade, accidentally bricked inside this enclosed space and unable to escape. The knocks gradually became quieter and then disappeared altogether. However, discussions about it not only did not cease but became even more active. This was because ghosts of the dock workers who had been walled in alive began to appear at the shipyard. About 100 passengers who had struggled to secure tickets for this ship suddenly returned them on the eve of departure. None of them could adequately explain the reason for such a decision. Moreover, even the owner of the ship himself, millionaire J.P. Morgan, refused to sail on the ship due to health reasons. Despite his poor health, he was seen smiling and cheerful in the following days, at one of the French resorts, arm in arm with his mistress. There were also apparent prophecies. For instance, in 1912, newlyweds Ted and Blanche Marshall were on their honeymoon on the Isle of Wight, near which the Titanic would pass. When Blanche saw the ship, she trembled and, exclaiming, "The ship won't make it to America, it will sink and many passengers will perish." She lost consciousness. Later, she told doctors and her husband that the cause was her vision. Initially, this was not taken seriously, with the assumption that the woman simply had mental issues. Even earlier, an American poetess in 1874 wrote a fateful song about the collision of a large ship with an iceberg. But the most famous case is when 14 years before the Titanic disaster, Morgan Robertson published the novel Futility, in which he remarkably accurately described the internal structure of the ship, even predicting its name. In Robertson's work, it was called the Titan. Even all the scientific and technical details of the fictional and real ships coincided, including the number of passengers, the quantity of lifeboats, and many other details. But what's most impressive is that the invented Titan met its end in precisely the same way, colliding with an iceberg. Many also attribute the ship's demise to an additional mystical reason, the curse of an ancient Egyptian prophetess. Her mummy was extracted from a tomb and sent on the Titanic for an exhibition in Los Angeles. She went down with the ship. It is believed that paranormal activity associated with the Titanic has intensified in recent times as parts of the sunken ship and personal belongings of passengers have been raised from the depths. Many visitors to exhibitions of these items reported with horror how seemingly apparitions would suddenly pull photos off walls or knock exhibits onto the floor, push tour guides and grab people by their hair. But the pranks of ghosts can be attributed to the impressionability of visitors. However, there is a real continuation of this story that is truly inexplicable by anything other than mysticism. For example, a ship with a similar name, Titanian, collided with an iceberg in 1939, terrifying the crew to death, having heard about the aforementioned tragedy. The falling of an unexplained iceberg onto the roof of a house during a Titanic movie viewing, as well as the drowning of the heroine of the cinematic Titanic, actress Kate Winslet, who played the role of Ophelia in the film Hamlet, can be considered some otherworldly jokes, or the water theme of another main character, actor DiCaprio in the movie The Beach. Thus, anything connected in any way to the tragedy of the ill-fated ship or its name carries a mystical threat. However, the most astonishing aspect of this decades-long history is that radio signals from the sinking Titanic are still being received to this day. One such case was recorded on April 15, 1972, when a radio operator on the U.S. military ship, Theodore Roosevelt, picked up a distress signal from the long-sunken ocean liner. The radio operator initially thought he was experiencing hallucinations or that someone was playing a prank on him. Perplexed, he requested confirmation from the shore. The response was surprisingly phlegmatic. "Do not respond to the SOS signal. Continue on the current course." In port, the command of the battleship was strongly informed that a long-sunken ship, for obvious reasons, could not be emitting signals. However, the radio operator of the ship that intercepted the SOS signal found it strange that representatives of the FBI, not his immediate superiors, provided explanations regarding his illusions, or an unidentified prankster on the airwaves. He didn't believe it and began his own investigation. It turned out that over the years, with a periodicity of once every 6 years, many other radio operators had heard similar signals from the sunken Titanic. One of the most inexplicable stories in this entire saga occurred in early August 1991. The research vessel, Larsen Napier, supposedly in the same location where the Titanic had sunk, reportedly picked up a lifeboat. In it was a bearded elderly man dressed in the early 20th century naval officer's uniform, claiming to be the captain of the Titanic. Since the man persistently insisted that it was 1912, he was placed in a psychiatric clinic. What happened to him afterward is unknown. In the same year, a deep-sea robot retrieved some items from the Titanic's wreckage that couldn't possibly belong there because they were from a different time. Among them was a gun believed to have been fired by the captain to quell panic, dated 1928, and a suitcase with $10,000 marked 1996. In 1992, a Norwegian ship engaged in herring fishing in the North Atlantic experienced engine failure. Simultaneously, fishermen observed a huge ship rising from the sea abyss on the right side, within their view. People were seen rushing and falling into the water on its deck. The ship's inscription identified it as the Titanic. However, within 2 minutes, the ghostly ship vanished into the waters of the Atlantic. On the water's surface, passengers from the sunken ship were visible struggling against the elements. Yet, the trawler fishermen couldn't approach them due to their engine failure, so they broadcasted an SOS signal answered by a U.S. military ship. It picked up about a dozen people in life jackets, marked Titanic. Interestingly, they were real people, not the ghosts of the deceased. However, all information about the incident was subsequently classified. In 1994, again in the Atlantic waters where the Titanic sank, sailors on a Danish fishing vessel saw a hypothermic 2-year-old girl and a lifebuoy. They pulled her out of the water, warmed her up, and provided medical assistance. Remarkably, the lifebuoy also had the inscription, Titanic. Attempts to investigate this case were unsuccessful. The girl was too young to tell anything, and when she grew up, she couldn't remember anything about what had happened to her. It's understandable that the appearance of people from the past at the site of the ship's demise seems absolutely impossible and doesn't align with any existing scientific theories. Parapsychologists have ventured into the investigation. According to their hypothesis, time loses its meaning in this location, forming a kind of loop. As a result, some passengers of the Titanic find themselves in our time. In other words, the Titanic collided not so much with an iceberg as with a time portal, causing not only objects but also people to move from the past to the future and vice versa. However, cases where contemporary individuals ended up in the past have not been documented. How would you even document such cases? Perhaps they were there in that location, but they perished along with other Titanic passengers. According to Lord Mersey's report, the ship perished due to a collision with an iceberg, and it happened because the ship was traveling at an unreasonably high speed under the circumstances. That's it. Beyond that, there are numerous conclusions. First, I will present the conclusions, and then some thoughts. Never again will people steer their ships into icy fields without heeding warnings, relying only on the strength of a few thousand tons of riveted steel sheets. Since that memorable night, transatlantic liners will take ice warnings seriously, attempt to navigate around hazardous areas, or proceed at a moderate pace. No one will believe in unsinkable ships anymore. Icebergs will no longer drift aimlessly across the seas. After the Titanic's demise, the American and English governments organized an international ice patrol, and today, Coast Guard ships monitor drifting icebergs heading toward sea routes. As an additional precaution, sea routes are shifted southward during the winter. And no more liners with radio watches for less than a full day. Every passenger ship now has a 24-hour radio watch. People will no longer perish because someone like Cyril Evans, 10 miles away from them, finished his watch and went to sleep. The Titanic was the last liner to set sail without a sufficient number of lifeboats. With a gross registered tonnage of 46,328, it was equipped according to hopelessly outdated safety regulations. According to these rules, a ship's need for lifeboats was determined by a ridiculous formula. All British ships with a gross registered tonnage exceeding 10,000 tons had to have 16 lifeboats with a total volume of more than 155.7 meter 3, plus an amount of rafts and floating devices equivalent to 75% of the lifeboat's volume. Additionally, Lord Mersey's report emphasized the necessity of proper training for the crew, both in terms of watchkeeping and in organizing and conducting lifeboat drills. Ironically, the report noted the need for monitoring the vision of sailors keeping watch on the bridge. Even more ironically, considering modern standards, there were requirements for the number of binoculars on ships. On the Titanic, there were 2 or 3 for the entire ship, Lookouts, in other words, not only lacked eagle-eyed vision but also lacked binoculars. The sinking of the Titanic marked a turning point in maritime safety. In general, before the Titanic's demise, mariners had not fully grasped and felt that they were already in the 20th century, that sailing ships were a thing of the past, and that navigation was becoming more vibrant, speeds were increasing, and ship sizes were growing with each passing day. The measures of the 19th century had become outdated and simply dangerous. The Titanic, in a sense, became a victim of the 19th century mentality applied to 20th century technology. To a modern ship captain, many of the practices prevalent on the Titanic's bridge would seem utterly absurd. How could one, knowing about icebergs and ice on the course, sail into the black unknown of the night without reducing speed? Back then, there were no radars, yet the speeds and sizes were already defined by the progress of the 20th century. How could they neglect to equip lookouts with binoculars? How could one navigate massive liners without universally accepted international distress signals, from radio to flares to rockets? How could a ship on whose bridge you stand be considered unsinkable, something that the crew and the public genuinely believed? Everything sinks, no matter how you make it. Nature is nature. The sinking of the Titanic instilled in the genes of subsequent generations of mariners a healthy skepticism towards unsinkability and a constant readiness for the worst, whether on the bridge or in the cabin during leisure time. The shock and subsequent organizational conclusions did a great deal to make people realize that it was the 20th century, and to avoid sea tragedies, existing rules needed a thorough review. And they were reviewed extensively. Many rules adopted after the Titanic remain in force to this day, without the need for significant adjustments. For this alone, a monument should be erected in memory of the Titanic. Its demise was not in vain. The iceberg that sent the Titanic to the bottom of the ocean was found 90 years later, almost 90 years after its demise. Tireless researchers and puzzle enthusiasts found the very iceberg that sent the Titanic to the depths and gave Cameron a bunch of Oscars. Photos of this scoundrel were in a private collection and had never been published anywhere. A thorough examination of the photos revealed that the iceberg captured in them bore traces of damage inflicted by a collision with a significant floating object of corresponding strength, steel that is. So a certain Stefan Regoric from Bohemia was on a journey aboard the Bremen liner, sailing from Bremerhaven to New York. On April 20, the Bremen passed the location of the catastrophe. All those on board the Bremen poured onto the deck, observing numerous remnants of the shipwreck in the water and something even more dreadful: dozens of bodies. The Bremen did not pick up the bodies only because the Mackay Bennett steamer, chartered specifically for this purpose, was scheduled to arrive in a few hours. Well, the hero of this story took a few photographs and sent them home from New York. The photographed iceberg matched its description given by survivors of the Titanic. In the days immediately following the tragedy, several photographs of icebergs were taken. However, after studying Regoric's photos, comparing them with eyewitness descriptions of the iceberg, and examining wind and current patterns, it can be reasonably assumed that the sought-after iceberg was photographed by only one person, Stefan Regoric, from the deck of the Bremen. These photos were only discovered in April 2000. The original copies of the photographs are currently stored in a bank vault in Munich.